Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Tuesday, March 26th, and we are going to be talking a variety of different comings in the sports world. We are going to be diving into the press conference that took place yesterday with Shohei Ohtani addressing the allegations against his interpreter and his whole perspective on the situation that has taken the national media by storm. Then we are going to be switching into some NFL talks where we get into the comments that Shedeur Sanders made during a podcast last Friday about what his son Shedeur and the other top prospect from Colorado in Travis Hunter should do when they approach the draft in the 2025 class. Then we are going to be going over some of the total win lines that were just released by DraftKings and giving some initial reactions to those. Finally, we're going to finish off with some March Madness talk, talking about some storylines headed into the Sweet 16 and specifically looking at some of the conversations that have taken place around the conferences. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. For our live viewers, use that comment section to give us your thoughts on all of these stories, make the show as interactive as possible. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net to get your comments top priority, and that would be greatly appreciated. But getting into the first segment of the day, talking about Shohei Ohtani addressing the media. This was the first time he's publicly spoken since all of the reports came out that his former interpreter, Ippei Mizuhara, allegedly stole at least $4.5 million from Ohtani to help pay off gambling debts. For those of you who haven't heard about this story just yet, it was late last week being reported that Ohtani's name was on a wire transfer to a man named Matthew Boyer, who runs an illegal bookmaking operation in California. Boyer, who is being investigated by federal agents, had his house stormed, and on some documents it was found that Ohtani was on some of these reports multiple wire transfers of $500,000, and Boyer, that is, communicate to the public through his lawyer that he has never personally met Shohei Ohtani, which does not fully excuse him of any sort of blame in this, but is worth noting. Mizuhara initially told the investigative reporters that Ohtani had made these two $500,000 transfers to help him pay off some of these debts. He later took back that statement and said he lied about it, but it hasn't stopped many from theorizing about what level of involvement Ohtani could have had in these dealings, from whether or not he was aware of what Mizuhara was doing gambling-wise, to the idea that Ohtani was actually the one who was gambling and this was a cover story. So we're going to be addressing all of this. But when Ohtani spoke to the media yesterday, he adamantly denied being a part of any of the gambling activities that took place. He stated that the wire transfers under his name were not him making those, and that he was beyond shocked to find out all about this. Now, some of the timeline stuff that has gone on with this story is definitely a little weird, considering the fact that Mizuhara had spoken to reporters about this idea. The LA Dodgers were aware of this story before it broke to the public, which is why in the clubhouse after their game against the Padres last week, some members of the front office came in and addressed the team, said that something big was going to break about them, obviously referring to this whole Ohtani situation. And at the time, Ohtani supposedly had no idea about any of this. The fact that they had no idea, that he had no idea, nobody had informed him that all these happenings were taking place. And keep in mind the fact that there was $4.5 million missing from his account. It is a little bit strange that he wasn't clued in any ways. There was also a quote that was given to ESPN reporters last week from a Shohei Ohtani spokesperson who gave a quote from Ohtani himself saying, quote, "Yeah, I sent several large payments. That's the maximum amount I could send." Now, again, it's been a lot of contradictions and a lot of back and forth on how this all played out. Curious again to that whole idea of the timeline when this spokesperson, this crisis management rep of Ohtani's camp spoke to ESPN in relation to when Mizuhara talked to ESPN. Now, again, both Ohtani and his party and Mizuhara himself have said that it was not true, that Ohtani had no idea about any of this. But again, it all sort of adds up to be this very murky situation in terms of the public information, what we can trust. But Ohtani, yesterday, he made his statement, again, adamantly denying his involvement in any way. But there was something that a lot of people took problem with, which was the fact that he did not answer any questions during this press conference. He just gave out a statement. Now, it's interesting because if we had gotten the chance to hear some questions, I'm very curious about how Mizuhara had that type of access to Ohtani's bank account. Now, it's not super uncommon for athletes to have individuals that are close to them to have some sort of access to the accounts. I also do feel like, and maybe I'm out of line saying this, but this is somebody in Mizuhara who, along with being his friend, which is a big time factor in all of this, is that they go back to the Angels and they supposedly had a very close relationship, which is why Ohtani was also so shocked when this all broke. But the fact that Mizuhara was so involved in his everyday life, we saw even when he wasn't speaking to the media, Mizuhara was just about everywhere on the baseball field with Ohtani and was essentially his liaisons in a way to be able to communicate with people. And Ohtani's coming from Japan. I'm sure he's picked up a level of English after spending all these years here in America now. But Ohtani is, in some ways responsible or in debt almost to Mizuhara to help him communicate with others in the country that he currently lives in. So there is a very real level of responsibility inherently that Mizuhara has when working with Ohtani in these situations. The fact that Mizuhara could have some access to his bank account isn't the most shocking thing in the world to me, but to allow multiple transactions of at least $500,000 go through and a total of at least $4.5 million leaving under his nose without any real resistance, that is definitely strange to me. Now, I guess this is a little bit of a defense of Ohtani here. At this point, he is now very, very much standing on his word that he is not responsible for any of these gambling activities. It would be very risky for him to, during a federal investigation, this obviously goes beyond just the levels of the MLB itself, but with the government to lie about this adamantly and to not fess up, that would be a risky move for him to do so. And I guess to some level we can maybe trust it somewhat more because of that. We have all these conflicting details that are out there, so there's no secret of what he could possibly be attached to. He is standing on the point that he is entirely innocent in this and that he is a victim. I guess in a little bit of a twisted way, us as MLB fans can just really hope that Ohtani is telling the truth and he is the victim in this situation, because this would be a really big deal and really negative for the sport of baseball as a whole if he is guilty in some of this. He is the number one star in the league in terms of even marketability. I know that some people may argue that Aaron Judge could be sort of that number one star based off of the market that he's played in and the level of success that he's had up to this point in his career. But I personally view Ohtani as the face of the league, and I think that it would be really devastating because we've seen the MLB have these issues with gambling and such in the past. We covered this a little bit last week, so we won't go too in depth, but with the Chicago Black Sox incident early in the 90s, as well as the Pete Rose saga that took place when he was a manager. And it's also important to note the fact that the bets that were being placed with this money, or at least that the money is tied to, were not surrounding baseball. So it's not quite to the extent of some of those scenarios. And professional athletes gambling has become quite the story over the past couple of years based off of the legalization of all these different regulated sports books, where we saw Calvin Ridley miss an entire year because he was gambling on sports. Now we have a new investigation that just broke last night about Raptors center Jonte Porter being investigated for some strange activity regarding some prop bets surrounding him. And it's just becoming a bigger and bigger deal as we sort of progress into this new era of sports gambling. Now, I believe firmly that at minimum, you should not be able to bet on your own sport, even if you are in a Pete Rose situation where you're betting on their team to win, to that you're not throwing the game, but you're still involved with it. I still don't agree with that. I feel like it leads to just messier situations. It's just easier to ban it outright. Some of the cross-sport betting is a little bit more defensible, but still at the same time, I do believe that it just leads to a little bit of a murky situation where it could be two athletes doing each other favors. Again, that's a whole different conversation, and we haven't had any actual experiences with that take place just yet, so there's no need to spend too much time on that. But this is obviously a massive story in not just the MLB, but sports as a whole. Kirito in the comment section just pointed out Jameson Williams as well got in trouble for betting on Alabama college football games. That's absolutely right, and he missed some time because of that. A little bit of a smaller profile, but a Patriots rookie from this past season, Kayshon Boutte, also was just arrested for illegal sports betting as well. So this is becoming a very prominent issue across all major leagues, and there has to be some sort of way we can work towards a place where we have a little bit more regulation. And again, regulation is sort of what sparks this whole thing because of the fact that it is so much more prominent. But for the Ohtani and Mizuhara case here, sports betting isn't allowed in the state of California anyways, so there's no reason that could possibly slide under any circumstances there. Kirito says Jameson Williams won all 4 bets though, so he has no regrets. I can't say that I've seen the betting logs for him, but to some degree, I mean, Jameson Williams, it definitely hindered his career up to this point. Not that I was very high on Jameson Williams coming out of college. He's had one of the most unconventional starts to a career as a whole with the injury that he had suffered coming into the NFL. I believe it was during the national championship game. I could be wrong. It was late in that season, one way or another, caused him to miss some time in his rookie year. And then he was dealing with this other suspension because of it. So we're seeing some repercussions for professional athletes and how it is affecting their careers. And Ohtani, again, this would be sort of the biggest fish. I don't know how many athletes really are bigger than Shohei Ohtani, especially if you're talking about respectively to the rest of their professional leagues. Ohtani is as big as it gets in baseball. And this is, the comparable situation would be a Patrick Mahomes getting caught in the NFL. So definitely a massive deal. It is also notable, not that, again, trying to slander anyone because there's no real base to this, but it's been pointed out as well that his agent, Nez Balelo, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, has also had a little bit of a spotty track record in terms of his career in the MLB. His former client, Ryan Braun, was caught for using performance-enhancing drugs during his 2011 MVP season. Now, again, Balelo has been silent up to this point during the scandal. It's unfair to drag him into this, considering nothing has been tied to him yet, but it is just another detail that people that are looking to find Ohtani's guilt are pointing to as well. Now, me personally, I don't think that Ohtani was responsible for betting on these games themselves. He could have known about Mizuhara's debts and helped pay him off in some increments. Like we've heard a couple of these quotes come out from both Mizuhara himself and the spokesperson that talked to ESPN last week before these statements were recanted. But it does sort of fall into this slippery slope of, well, he himself paid off these $500,000 increments. The other $3.5 million, let's see sort of like where is that money? To my knowledge, at least, it hasn't necessarily fully been reported on. There's still a lot of questions surrounding this situation as a whole, and it's just very interesting to sort of see how this is all going to play out. And also, let's say Ohtani, again, not that it's, if Ohtani was aware of those, totaling $1 million wire transfers that took place, how is it possible he could be that aware of those and then not notice the other $3.5 million, not notice that there was anything going on? The stories and the reports that have come out is that he was completely blindsided as this all came out. Just very interesting to weigh all of the different perspectives that we've gotten up to this point. And again, I do think that it leads to this bigger conversation in terms of how we can regulate gambling in professional sports and how that affects athletes as well. But for this case alone, Ohtani is, again, just about the biggest individual player in all of American sports that could get caught for such a thing, and it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. We had somebody in our comment section last week when we talked about this. He was a live viewer from Japan itself, and Ohtani, obviously a massive international star, as he was in Japan and then came to the MLB and has risen to the stardom that he has. This viewer sort of alluded to the fact that the way that this was all being reported in Japan was that Ohtani was an accomplice in all of this and that he's being framed in a lot more of a guilty sense. I feel like here in America, a lot of what we're looking at is people, myself included, wanting Ohtani to be innocent because it is, again, it would be detrimental if he weren't in this situation. And I feel like it's going to, I feel like we're just going to get more details as this comes out. Again, Ohtani has not yet answered questions, so we've taken a step in the direction of getting some more actual statements that are on the record. But until we get some answers, there are going to be a lot of different theories flying around. Definitely let me know how you guys feel about this situation in the comment section. But we are going to be taking our first break, and when we come back on the other side, we will be getting into some of the comments that Deion Sanders made on Friday about the futures of two of Colorado's star prospects headed into next year's draft and what it could mean big term in terms of player empowerment in the NFL. So stick with us and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up our first segment talking about the Shohei Ohtani situation that has been going on and the allegations against his interpreter, Ippei Mizuhara, and sort of the bigger scale implications as well in terms of gambling and professional sports. But now we are going to be headed into our second segment of the day, talking about Deion Sanders and his comments on the futures of some of his star players. So on Friday, he went on the Barstool Sports Podcast, $1 Million Worth of Game, and he talked about some of the top guys for Colorado and his son, Shedeur Sanders, who is by many people seen to be the number one quarterback in next year's class. Granted, not the strongest of quarterback classes as things currently stand, but the fact that he and Travis Hunter, he expects to both go in the top 4 of the 2025 NFL draft. But he also said that both prospects could absolutely be looking to, as he put it, pull an Eli, or it's going to be an Eli, in terms of them forcing their ways out of unfavorable situations where this has been a topic of discussion, especially as last week Robert Griffin III, former NFL quarterback, said that Caleb Williams should look at the way that the Bears have handled the Justin Fields situation over the course of the past few seasons, and that he should demand that the Bears don't draft him, which is something that in a different light I disagree with, because I do think the Bears have actually done a good job of setting up whoever their next quarterback is to succeed with the receiver options that they've added, with the improved roster as a whole, offensive line taking steps in the right direction. DeAndre Swift is a very solid running back, and their defense has taken some steps in the right direction as well. And now we're looking at this situation where, you know, we saw the possibility. Caleb Williams' dad was talking about how they may remain in college for another season because of the amount of NIL money that college athletes can now make, that they're not desperate for the NFL professional salary like players were in the past, which is absolutely a factor. But At the same time, the level of money, or the amount of money, I should say, that a player can make off of NIL, and Shedeur Sanders is one of the highest paid college football players and really college athletes as a whole based off of the NIL deals that he's made up to this point. I think it's over $4 million even, which is, and I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, so correct me if I'm wrong, but, and he comes from a family, obviously the Sanders family, that we know is not at a dire need of money either way. So he is a little bit of a special case in this situation, but I don't think that this is going to long-term be the way that things progress here. Now, I'm always pro player over pro. I can't say always. The NBA has some level of pro player that can be almost a little bit frustrating, but overall, I think that athletes at any level should be compensated based off of what they sort of bring to an organization and the revenue that they make other people. They should also be compensated for that. So I do understand that we're heading into an era with NIL. We're still very early in this whole, era of that kind of payment that college athletes can make. But I also think that as much as you can make money in college off of these deals, especially when you're looking at a league like the NFL, which is one of course, the juggernauts in professional sports in terms of how much money you can make, it gets really risky in some of these situations. And one specific situation that I sort of look back to, and it's not, 100%, it was a handful of years ago, so I would have to revisit some of the specific situations that were surrounding it at the time. But I remember Dak Prescott having a very solid junior year when he was in college at Mississippi State, and seemed like he could sort of climb his way into being a high draft pick. He returned for a fourth year and was not quite as good, or unless it was I again have to revisit this, but I remember the extra year that Dak Prescott stayed one way or another ended up hurting his draft stock, and he fell to the fourth round, which, yes, you're still getting paid in the NFL, but it is obviously not to the level of being a first round pick. And I think it's a real gamble a lot of the times if these players are going to try and stay in college long term and risk having an injury or just playing worse, where we saw two of the top prospects in terms of quarterbacks heading into this draft in Caleb Williams and in Drake May. Now they're both going to be first round picks, so not that it's been any sort of devastating turns of events, but they were seen as automatic. Caleb Williams being a generational draft pick, the can't miss guy. Drake May, headed into the regular season of college football, it seemed like a lot of people were on the boat of any other draft outside of the Caleb Williams draft, he would go number one overall as well. And now there's a lot more questions that people have sort of generated as a result of some ups and downs this season, their teams not being quite as successful. And again, they're both going to be top 3, top 4 overall picks. So this isn't even that detrimental of a situation. But again, I do sort of push back a little bit. I think it's going to be tough to see, all these players. And granted, there have to be very special circumstances here with a lot of these situations where, the players, try and act bigger than the NFL itself. And obviously the players make up the NFL, but the ones with power are, of course, the owners. The NFL is a factory of all factories where we see it year in, year out of, these franchises continuing to move on while there's a very finite time period where athletes, even at the top of their class, can, produce at the highest level. You only have, 2-3 big time paychecks that you can get from the NFL. And I feel like gambling with that, maybe it works out for the likes of a Shedeur Sanders or a Travis Hunter, but I don't think it's always that easy to just sort of mail it in. They are still, now with all of these comments, we're still a full college football season away. We'll have to see how this all plays out, but I am not too sure how much we're really going to be able to see the players, force their will on these teams. Deion did give a list of teams that both of these players would be open to playing for. It's a little bit of a strange list in my eyes, but it was the Atlanta Falcons, Washington Commanders, Dallas Cowboys, Baltimore Ravens, and San Francisco 49ers. Now, I'll have to go back and see if he sort of expands on some of these ideas on why these teams specifically, but it is definitely a bit of a weird grouping here where obviously Falcons, Commanders are at the bottom of the draft order this year, or top depending on how you want to look at it, but bottom of the standings last year, Falcons won 7 games, but still, we're in the top 10, in the top 8 specifically in this coming year's draft. And then you have the Cowboys, for as much drama as we hear some of these family members of Cowboys players like the Diggses, we've seen the Lambs, the Parsons, the Prescotts, all of them, their siblings or family members getting involved in the conversation about sort of the high stakes pressure under these. But who knows? To Kirito's comment about the NFL hating the celebrations of some of these anime shows, I gotta be honest, I couldn't tell you why. I feel like the NFL has taken some steps in the right direction in terms of allowing a little bit more fun, but at the same time, with Roger Goodell, you never really know what you are going to get from him. The NFL, in all aspects, really have been extremely inconsistent in some of their punishments and such, with some of the fines. Yesterday on the show, we talked about some of the defensive players that have received fines for hits and such, and it's not the smoothest run organization, obviously, in the NFL. So I couldn't give you the defined answer as to that. But I just feel like it is interesting going forward here, because as much as we are heading into more and more area, like if you look back at the Deshaun Watson situation when he wanted out in Houston, and for as much, of course, drama that went on as he was being accused of the sexual harassment suits at the same time, he ended up getting what he wanted in going to Cleveland, the Texans getting a ransom of picks, and Deshaun Watson getting a fully guaranteed contract as a result of it. So we've seen quarterbacks now be able to assert their will a little bit more in recent years to a level that we haven't seen in the past. Quarterbacks, obviously, the reason why they're sort of on this level that other players aren't, and we've seen the running back market sort of take a hit by the past handful of seasons, is because the idea with running backs, and it's sort of a microcosm, but the biggest example of the bigger overall story, is the fact that everybody's replaceable in the NFL for the most part. Quarterbacks are a little bit of the exception to that, which is why we see some of these quarterbacks have more power than anybody else, and why Caleb Williams could have been an interesting case coming into this draft. But at the same time, I don't know how far we are fully going to be able to come. I know that a lot of people are signifying that this is the beginning of this new, era. Again, I don't want to overuse the term, but sort of new era of, with the NIL, players being able to determine their futures a little bit more going forward. I just feel like even with those cases that could possibly be the result, it's very far and few. There's just not going to be a significant amount of those players that can ultimately change the landscape of the NFL long term, or on a, league shaking course like that. Kirito asks, Dak Prescott going to ask out by the trade deadline? I feel like they're going to find their way to an agreement. I expect Dak to be back. I definitely don't think that he's going to be traded mid-season unless there is something really wrong with the organization. For the Cowboys, I would imagine that they're going to work out a long-term deal with him, that they are going to pay him a massive number to stay in Dallas, which I know isn't the most popular idea for a lot of people. I can understand why they would, and I don't think that the Cowboys are necessarily in a situation such as you were in the live show yesterday. We talked about some of these quarterback-friendly environments where you have the San Franciscos, the Miamis of the world, where they have all of this surrounding talent and they have incredible coordinators of the offensive game that make it easy to succeed in the environment. I just don't believe the Cowboys are at that same level. CeeDee Lamb doesn't get enough credit as one of the best receivers in the league. Obviously, now he's being talked more so about it based off of this past season. But outside of that, I don't think the Cowboys are tremendous on offense. They just lost a couple offensive linemen to start this year, and they haven't really added anything else yet. Now, maybe it is a mistake for them to cough up that much money to Dak Prescott, but I also do think that he's coming off of his best season of his career. I do not blame him for the playoff loss. I thought that fell on the laps of the defense, who just got ran over by the Green Bay offense. So I expect Dak to be back in Dallas for the foreseeable future. I don't think that they let him hit open free agency at any point. Now, we'll see, but that would be so opposite of this whole all-in mantra. I feel like that they talked about headed in, and I know at this point it's been talked about too much. Clearly, that was a misspeak almost by Jerry Jones, because the organization was not ready to be all in on this year in particular. But unless you really believe that Trey Lance can emerge as a long-term option, which I don't want to fully turn the page on him. I feel like he never got the full chance there, but unless that's going to work out, I don't think that the Cowboys have a backup plan, and they're going to be very interesting to see going forward how they choose to operate. But we're going to be continuing on with some NFL thoughts in our next segment as we preview some of the team win lines that were just released by DraftKings yesterday. Just going to be running through these, and I will be pointing out which lines I thought stood out the most, as we've also been talking about gambling on this show as well. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about some of the player empowerment that is sort of picking up motion in the NFL and Deion Sanders' comments on what the Colorado Stars will do next year. Now we are going to be sticking with some football and looking over the win totals that have been released by DraftKings Sportsbook yesterday. Every team was given an over-under win total line, and it's important to keep in mind here that NFL free agency is not NFL offseason is not totally wrapped up. Neither the free agents have fully been signed or the draft has played out yet. So the perceptions on some of these teams can change. I'm sure that some of the actual lines will change as time comes, but I just wanted to sort of take a look into some of these as they currently stand. The Chiefs, 49ers, and Ravens lead the pack, come in tied for the most wins, or the highest line, I should say, at 11.5. Wanted to start there. If I had to bet the over on any one of these teams, I would go with the 49ers. They've had 12 wins or more during the past two seasons. This upcoming season is probably the last one where they will likely have all of their pieces from that nucleus that they've been to back-to-back NFC championships with and the Super Bowl last season. There are some subtle rumors about the future of Brandon Ayuk and whether or not he will be back. He's headed into the final season on his contract. Yesterday, he posted a cryptic message with some emojis on his Instagram story that can be interpreted as cash talks, BS walks. This was in response to the general manager of the 49ers, John Lynch, making a comment about how they want him to remain a part of the organization. Ayuk basically saying, put your money where your mouth is. If you want me here, then pay me. So we'll see how all of this plays out. I would probably guess that Ayuk is going to at least be there for the upcoming season. It wouldn't make sense to me, as they are in that top tier of contenders, to move on from him. I know a lot of the times you are looking for trying to maximize every asset. That expiring contracts can be a scary thing. But at the same time, I think that they are in contention for the Super Bowl, and it's just about putting the best team possible on the field. They are going to have to pay Brock Purdy in the near future. You're getting that level of quarterback play for under $1 million. You got to do what you can outside of that position to maximize your potential there. Maybe he threatens sitting out, but I think at a certain point, they probably will come to at least some sort of an understanding for him to be playing for them during the year. They do have to worry about the loss of Dre Greenlaw, who isn't going to be out for the entire year, but of course tore his Achilles during the Super Bowl. That's going to keep him out for a lot of the regular season. He should be back by the playoffs, but how much will this impact the way that their defense performs? And we're talking about just regular season wins here. So maybe we could see a little bit of a dip there. They did lose Oren Burks, who stepped in for Greenlaw during the Super Bowl there. Burks ended up getting, frankly, torched a little bit in pass coverage during that game as it was. So not like it's a massive loss, but they could probably look to add some depth at the linebacker position going forward to at least help during that stretch without Greenlaw. So we will see there. The Niners are going to have a lot of financial decisions to make going forward, but if they can get everybody on board to run it back this season, they have, in a wide open NFC, an incredible chance to make it back to the Super Bowl. And I find it hard to believe that they're going to win less games this year than they did last year. Last piece on it. would maybe be the injury concern. We've seen the way that some of their star players have missed significant amounts of time. Last year, they got a healthy George Kittle season, but Trent Williams was in and out with injuries. Christian McCaffrey was healthy for the most part, but we've seen in the past with him dealing with some injuries. And Deebo Samuel is another one where even in the playoffs, he was not at 100%. But I still ride with the Niners to probably, I don't have the odds on who's going to have the best record. And again, we're still ahead of the draft anyways, so not everything is played out. But as it currently stands today on March 26th, I would go with the Niners for having the best record in the NFL. Part of the reason why I lean with the Niners over the Ravens is because of the level of competition within their own division. Ravens had the most wins in the league last season. I expect them to have another strong season, but their division is very difficult. Every team in the AFC North had a winning record last season, and that is with all three of those other teams dealing with injuries to their starting quarterbacks. Kenny Pickett played 12 games, Joe Burrow played 10, and Deshaun Watson played 6. Of course, Kenny Pickett's not going to be back for this upcoming season, but he was their starter for the season. I know Mason Rudolph ended up getting the last couple starts over him, but one way or another, their initial plan for the year went down with injury, was in and out there. So, I know that there's a little bit of a reputation with Burrow and Watson about some of their lack of ability to stay on the field, but if they do get to play, I think that it is a very tough division. And last year it was, despite a lot of these guys not even playing for them as it was. The Ravens were the number one scoring defense in the NFL last season. They have lost a couple of key players on that side of the ball, such as Patrick Queen and Geno Stone. They should still be a really good unit. I don't know about number one scoring. They do have studs on all three levels, though, in Justin Madubuike, Roquan Smith, and Kyle Hamilton. So I don't expect any sort of a drastic fall off there. They add Derrick Henry to make their run game even that much scarier, as they were the number one rush offense last year as well. So they could definitely be an over candidate, but again, there's a chance in that AFC North division that those teams can beat up on one another, and that might be what holds the Ravens to under 11.5 wins. Next set of teams at 10.5 is the Bengals, Bills, Cowboys, Dolphins, Eagles, Falcons, Lions, and Packers. Out of this group, I thought that the Falcons felt a little bit high. The NFC South was not good last season. The Bucs won it all in their division, that is, with 9 wins, that is. I do expect the Falcons to win their division this season, and I do think that they can get to double digit, but 11 seems a little bit high for them. The state of Kirk Cousins returning from this torn Achilles injury has some question marks around it, and their quarterback situation last year was horrendous. They still won 7 games. Their head coach last year didn't really know what he was doing. They bring in Raheem Morris, who has some championship pedigree as well from when he was the defensive coordinator of the Rams. The thought process for the Falcons here is that as long as Kirk Cousins isn't terrible and can help manage them in a better way, they should be able to win a lot of football games. There are still some tough outs in their division, in my opinion. I know that the Saints and Buccaneers aren't extremely scary. The Buccaneers did win a playoff game, but I do feel like a lot of that was due to the state of the Eagles at the time. But I do feel like this is another division that can beat up on one another a little bit. And I like the Falcons this season. I would like the over for them a little bit more if they were set at 9.5, but we will see with that. Maybe I'm too low on them. The Cowboys and Eagles are on the same line here, which doesn't shock me. They are the 2 top teams in their division, 2 of the biggest names in the conference. I would probably lean towards betting the over on the Cowboys over the Eagles in this one, which might be a little bit of an unpopular opinion. I'm not totally sure. I just feel like the Cowboys are a good regular season team. And with Mike McCarthy and with Dak Prescott, you might not trust them in the playoffs, but historically, they've been very solid during the regular season. Dak is coming off of the best year of his career. They have an incredible home field advantage. They were 8-0 last season with some of the most dominant wins of the year. And I feel like they can work their way into a double-digit win season and probably position themselves well for the playoffs. Eagles have a lot of changing pieces. I think they might get off to a little bit of a slower start. Come the playoffs, I would probably lean the Eagles, but again, getting way ahead of ourselves here as the draft has not even happened yet. The Jets and Texans are both set at 9.5. I feel like that's the perfect line for both of those teams. I can see the clear path for them to go over, but it would not surprise me if they went under. Texans, everybody loves them right now, but if there was a little bit of a regression in CJ Stroud's sophomore years as teams figure him out a little bit more, I still think he's great, but we see this happen sometimes with quarterbacks before they take off in their third year. They had that new coach syndrome bringing in D'Amico Ryans last season. I do think that they improved a lot of pieces on their roster as well, which I don't know. I would probably lean the over with them, but if there was regression at the quarterback position, it wouldn't shock me, and I do believe that division is going to actually take a step forward around them as well. The Bears, Browns, Buccaneers, Chargers, Colts, Jaguars, and Rams are all set at 8.5. The Chargers feel like an under to me out of this group. They are going to probably need a great draft to help elevate them. They were very limited in free agency this past year because of the salary cap situation. They do have the 5th overall pick, so they're probably going to try and add a big-time weapon on the perimeter. They need offensive playmakers after losing so many of their guys to free agency because of this cap situation, and they're going to be leaning very heavily on Justin Herbert. In Jim Harbaugh's first season with the team, it should be an interesting watch, but I would lean with the under. Jaguars and Colts are on the same line. I would probably lean towards the Jags over in comparison to the Colts. Last season was a total collapse for them. Trevor Lawrence's injury late in the season did not help them. They added some help on the trenches on both sides with Mitch Morse at center on offense and Eric Armstead on the defensive line. They replaced Calvin Ridley with Gabe Davis. Is probably a little bit of a downgrade, but I don't think a detrimental amount there. Anthony Richardson is, interesting potential there with the Colts. I love the offense that Shane Steichen runs. They have some real playmakers. They brought back Pittman this year. Still have Downs improving. Still have Jonathan Taylor. So the line is probably right for both of these teams. I think it's going to become very close, but I don't see the Jags losing more games this season than they did last year, which is why I would go over with the Jags. The Saints, Seahawks, Steelers, and Commanders are all set at 7.5. I do like some of the moves that the Commanders made this offseason. Dan Quinn, their new head coach, should help to elevate their defense. Whoever they have at quarterback, I just don't think is going to come out of the gates blazing. Very interesting traction on J.J. McCarthy in terms of his potential to go number 2 overall. We'll see, but whether it's McCarthy, May, or Jaden Daniels, I think that the ceiling is there with each and every one of them, but it's definitely some raw aspects to all of them. NFC East has the top good teams. The Commanders were 0-6 in the division last year. They might steal, 1 or 2 of those games. The Giants still aren't great, but to win 4 more games than they did last year, I'm not sure if I am there just yet. Cardinals, Giants, Raiders, and Vikings are all at 6.5. The Cardinals could be an over team if Kyler Murray is fully healthy this season. I really like Jonathan Gannon. I thought he had the Cardinals last year that were severely undermanned. We're starting Josh Dobbs for the first half of the season. They were really competitive, and I think that they should improve on last year. They have the 4th overall pick. Not sure what they're going to do yet in terms of drafting Marvin Harrison Jr. or trying to trade out, get a handful of picks, as there are probably 4 top quarterbacks in this class that, the top 4 picks could have a lot of value. Maybe they feel the need to trade back and sort of reshuffle their assets, but I'd like this a lot if they end up getting Marvin Harrison Jr. This is a line that I do think could move. The Broncos and Titans are set at 5.5. Panthers and Patriots are set at 4.5. Listen, I know I'm a Patriots fan here, so, you tell me in the comment section if I'm delusional here. 4.5 feels very low for the Patriots in my eyes. Last year was a disaster season for them. They win just 4 games. There's definitely a lot of unknown with the Patriots this upcoming season. Rookie head coach in Gerard Mayo. Don't know who their starter is going to be at quarterback just yet. And definitely gaps along the rest of the offense in terms of legitimate receiving threats and an offensive line. But last year, their offense was just absolutely horrendous. Their defense was great, though, and that was without Matthew Judon and Christian Gonzalez, basically their 2 best players on the roster as a whole. If their offense can just be some semblance of competent, they can win more games. The New England Patriots quarterbacks between Mac Jones and Bailey Zappi threw 21 interceptions last season, tied for the 2nd most in the league. And I believe that, if they can find, they do definitely still have holes on that offense, which can hold them back. But if they were to get a good rookie quarterback and find a weapon for him, I don't think it would be totally unrealistic. Definitely not to the level of success that the Texans had winning a playoff game, but they can see a little bit of a similar jump with a rookie head coach, former player, buy-in from the locker room, help coach up the defense to help them overperform, and again, big if on they hit with the quarterback, but get some better play from the position as well. I also believe that Jacoby Brissett will be an upgrade over whatever they had last year, but let me know what you guys think on my thoughts here, on my predictions here, what lines jump out to you. We are going to be taking our final break here, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to wrap up with some college basketball thoughts as we head into the Sweet 16 in a couple days. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into the final segment of the day where we are going to be talking some March Madness, sort of slow playing this a little bit as we have a couple days left until the Sweet 16 officially starts, but I did want to do a little bit of a review of where we are currently at, where we can quickly run through the matchups that are ahead. Not going to give necessarily predictions or anything just yet, but we have Clemson versus Arizona, San Diego State versus UConn in the national championship rematch from last season, Alabama, North Carolina, Illinois, Iowa State, NC State, Marquette, Gonzaga, Purdue, Duke, Houston, and Creighton versus Tennessee. If you'll notice with some of these matchups, one of the biggest stories in terms of individual conferences based off of how the first few rounds have played out is the fact that the ACC after having a lot of scrutiny around them during the regular season, people saying that the conference was sort of past its prime, that they're too top heavy, and that last claim, this doesn't necessarily fully disprove that, but they've been tremendous since the round of 64 started, 8-0 since the round of 64, and two teams that have overachieved in order to make it to the second weekend, in Clemson being an incredible, team up to this point, where they have some dominant wins, killed New Mexico in the first round, and took it to Baylor in the past season. Or in the past round, that is, as well. And of course, we have NC State, the only double-digit seed remaining in the tournament, who have cruised their way into a Sweet 16 matchup. Definitely viewed by a lot of people as the weakest team remaining. They were able to come out of the first round and then face off against an Oakland team that was maybe not necessarily seen as the biggest threat. They were the last really remaining potential Cinderella story that was in the tournament. But again, 8-0 since the round of 64 started. That is a little subjective, considering the fact that we can't fully ignore the very embarrassing performance that Virginia put on in the first 4 game. But even the top ACC defenders would probably argue that Virginia shouldn't have been the team that was in the tournament anyways. If anything, I feel like a lot of people would have argued more for Pittsburgh, who was in the first 4 out of that group as it was. But very impressive from the ACC here. Again, one of the more historic conferences in college basketball, and they've done a really good job of establishing themselves to make it to this second weekend. And if you look around at the upcoming games for Thursday and Friday, we have each one of them facing off against a different conference, where we have Clemson taking on Arizona of the Pac-12, North Carolina taking on Alabama of the SEC, NC State taking on Marquette of the Big East, and the last team we have is Duke taking on Houston in the Big 12. So if you are an ACC, apologist isn't the right term in this. I guess it would be fan, but I don't know how much, people are fans of the ACC conference as a whole. But if you're a defender of the ACC, this is a big time weekend where there are going to be a handful of opportunities to prove themselves. Now, in 3 of these 4 games, the ACC teams are the lower seeded programs and are the underdogs in these matchups. So I do feel like it's important in these games and sort of the first 2 rounds that we've already seen. You can't really fully play revisionist history where you can go back and sort of get on the case of the committee and these individual programs, saying it's an indictment on the conference as a whole if they don't pick up these upset wins. That's not really fair in my eyes. But first off, when is sports fandom ever truly fair when you look at a national perspective? But I just feel like it is an interesting storyline here. UNC, I feel very confident. I have not been a believer in Alabama. Now, I do want to give them some credit for the fact that they were able to win this ugly offensive game against Grand Canyon, and they haven't really been able to play defense for a lot of the year. Coming into the tournament, I believe they were something like 115 in KenPom in terms of defensive rating. That's maybe changed since then after this Grand Canyon game, but Grand Canyon also just sort of threw up on themselves as well. As Charles Barkley put it, one of the ugliest basketball games you will ever watch took place in the round of 32 there. So still a lot of, you can call it unknowns with these ACC teams going forward, but I did want to highlight that after, there was definitely a lot of conversation this season about the way that the selection committee sort of, and just the national media as a whole, discredited the ACC. I'm not saying that either side is right necessarily. We're just stating the facts here. But another team that was, or another conference, I should say, that a lot of people felt like there were not enough teams, enough representatives of, was the Big East. Of course, we have UConn, the top team in the conference as a whole, but Marquette and Creighton as well, and they have looked tremendous up to this point in the tournament, where they've looked tremendous up to this point in the tournament, to the point where Dan Hurley is calling out the fact that there were the likes of a Seton Hall or a St. John's that were competitive with them during the regular season, and meanwhile they're killing all these other programs. The Big East is in another situation here where all of these teams were seeded in the top 3 that made it. So they all should be sitting here in the second weekend as it currently stands. It's not like they have necessarily dug themselves out. And there's nothing else these Big East representatives could have done. They've won the games they're supposed to, and now here they are. But again, it's a situation where a lot of people, because of the fact that each of these 3 teams has reached the second weekend, are saying, oh, well, look, the selection committee should have put more in. If we have to keep in mind the fact that there were a handful of teams that would not have made the tournament at all if they didn't go on to steal at-large bids by winning their conference tournaments and going on these runs. And a handful of these teams are out now. NC State is the only one that still remains in that sort of context, but the bid stealers sort of shortened that bubble, and the selection committee didn't have as much necessarily to do. Now, if you're going to tell me that Seton Hall should have been in over Virginia, I'm absolutely not going to argue with you on that point. But outside of that, I do feel like options were pretty limited as a whole based off of how the conference tournaments all played out in this one. And here we are sitting in a situation where both the ACC and the Big East have been very successful since the round of 64 and have their representatives. The ACC have the most teams left in the tournament with 4. The Big East is second with 3. And definitely credit to those programs, but again, it's a little bit hard to sort of play this retrospect game after knowing the results of, also keep in mind, a one-and-done tournament where it's not easy necessarily to sort of judge an entire... I just don't think you can judge an entire season based off of a neutral site one-game series. But that's, I guess, besides the point. A couple other conferences I wanted to talk about here were the SEC, who had a miserable start to the tournament based off of some of these upset losses. South Carolina went down early, and they were in pretty rough shape there for a bit, but they have 2 remaining teams left in Tennessee, who has looked like one of the best teams in the conference. I definitely still think, even in an ugly game like they had versus Texas, I talked about yesterday how I thought that it was pretty impressive how they've shown that they are able to win in different ways. And another team in Alabama who I didn't think that they were built to win in different ways, and they at least did last round against Grand Canyon for whatever that was worth. But obviously the biggest upset in the tournament with Kentucky losing in the first round does discredit them some, but ultimately I do feel like Tennessee is a team that can make a real run here going forward. And I also wanted to briefly touch on the Mountain West, who have been a very polarizing conference, it feels, over the past handful of years, because their tournament history is not very good. We see many of these teams often end up as early exits. We basically just have San Diego State holding it down, the only team in the Mountain West to advance to the Sweet 16, or even, I believe, advance past the first round. That can't be true, as I'm saying it out loud, but a very bad track record with the Mountain West as a whole. But San Diego State putting the conference on its back. A lot of people will argue that, oh yeah, it can't be the only team, because Utah State made it to the last round. So that was a false statement on my part. I knew as soon as I was saying it that could not have made sense. But either way, I think that the Mountain West, a lot of people will argue that the Mountain West was underseeded, and that's the reason why they haven't had the level of success that a lot of people were claiming they were. I'm going to push back on that a little bit, specifically if you look at Utah State, who was one of these teams. They won the regular season Mountain West championship, the title, and they came in as a 9 seed. So a lot of people can argue, oh, well, they shouldn't have had to play Purdue in that second round. That game was never close from the first couple minutes when Edey was dominating them inside, and it was their Purdue's other player. I can't believe I'm blanking on it right now. The forward, I'm going to pull it up right now and be mad at myself that I didn't have it ready on the go. But it was Kaufman-Renn was just drawing all these fouls immediately. You could tell that Utah was not going to be able to stick with Purdue through the course of the entire game, and that's exactly what happened, and they end up getting their doors blown off. So Mountain West, I can have a little bit of sympathy because, you know, they had to play some harder games. But still, New Mexico was one of the most popular first-round upsets. They never stood a chance. Utah State never stood a chance against Purdue. Again, both of these situations where maybe a little bit underseeded, but at the same time, got to come through in those moments. Nevada, we don't even really have to get into them blowing the 17-point lead in the second half. Again, all of these teams, the lower seeds, but to lose the games in the way that they did, I do feel like is pretty detrimental. And we'll see what San Diego State has going for them headed into their big matchup against UConn. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. Helps us out a lot. And we will see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. And have a good one.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.